I guess y'all are being quiet because you want to get started, huh? The subcommittee will come to order. Good morning, and thank you all for being here. I want to welcome everyone to our hearing this morning on building a 21st century infrastructure for America, a water stakeholders perspective. But before we get started, I want to extend our thoughts and prayers to the victims of Hurricane Irma, Hurricane Harvey, Hurricane Maria. I know that we have millions of Americans that are continuing to suffer and struggle through recovery efforts across the United States. And I also know that there have been extraordinary generosity from members of the public across the United States and across the world reaching out and offering resources and help and many donations and services to a lot of our victims. But I ask that we all continue to keep the victims in our thoughts and prayers. And Mexico, thank you very much. As chairman of the subcommittee oversight of the Corps of Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency, I can assure everyone that we're working closely with our federal agencies to ensure a speedy recovery for the states and communities that have been impacted by these awful storms. Since the subcommittee's first hearing in March, we've explored a variety of potential ideas for inclusion in the infrastructure package. And of course, our water needs, water and wastewater, are an important component of that. But I'm happy that today we have a diverse panel that is very well invested into water and wastewater infrastructure to help inform some of our efforts moving forward. We're all well aware of the needs for communities to address water and wastewater infrastructure, that they're substantial and that these needs are going to continue to grow moving forward. In many communities, the water and wastewater infrastructure is long past its design life, its intended service life. It is in urgent need of repair, replacement, and upgrading. As a result, leaks, blockages are all too familiar and experienced across the United States and represent a massive waste of vital and sometimes scarce resources. We have much needs in regard to combined sewer overflows, sanitary sewer overflows, and other challenges that is affecting the performance and environmental impacts, and of course, ultimately the impacts on the end user of many of these systems. Shrinking municipal budgets, insufficient independent financing capabilities, and increasingly burdensome regulations without commensurate federal support have compounded these problems and the community's efforts to address them across the United States. According to the EPA, the documented needs for sustainable wastewater infrastructure, CSO and SSO corrections, and stormwater management are over $270 billion over the next 20 years. Extraordinary figure, I'll say that again. The needs over the next 20 years are estimated to be approximately $270 billion. The needs for drinking water infrastructure drive this figure to over $600 billion, and these are very conservative estimates. So we talk a major infrastructure package today. We ask the not-so-simple question, what can we do? We ask the question, what should we do? What is the role of the federal government in these infrastructure investments moving forward? And how do we best invest these scarce resources to efficiently achieve the objectives that we all share in regard to water and wastewater infrastructure? I believe it's going to take an all-hands-on-deck approach to reverse the decline of our nation's infrastructure. Federal, state, and local investment will be necessary, but cannot be relied upon to solve all of our problems. Instead, we need to move away from a business as usual and utilize every tool that's in our toolbox. This means searching for new sources of funding. This means increasing collaboration between public and private entities. This means doing a better job, more efficiently, investing the scarce resources that we have available. Earlier this year, we had a hearing on integrated water management, on integrated planning, talking about opportunities for efficiency there and ensuring that we're actually investing dollars to achieve the problems rather than spending dollars on process. We need smarter asset management and increased efficiencies in our water systems, and to do so, we need to incentivize the adoption of new and innovative technologies that will cut costs and improve water quality. And as Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, Maria showed us this past month, we need to build resiliently. Treatment plants in Texas, Louisiana, Florida, and elsewhere have been unable to cope with the influx from Harvey, Irma, Maria, causing poorly treated wastewater and raw sewage to flow into city streets and nearby waterways. This has not only caused numerous public health and environmental concerns, but also challenges our national security. We need to carefully prioritize our investments in water infrastructure to ensure we're adequately protecting the public health, promoting the economic growth of our communities, and preventing the degradation of our environment. I look forward to hearing thoughts from witnesses today, and now recognize the Ranking Member Napolitano for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Graves, because you're highlighting this critical need to address all of our drinking water-related infrastructure. Next month is the 45th anniversary of the enactment of the Clean Water Act, the main reason why our nation's waterways experience historic improvements in water quality, even as the population increased by over 50%. To a large degree, the success of that act resulted from a strong federal commitment to invest in its wastewater infrastructure improvements around the country. In recent years, states and communities have started to question whether the federal commitment to invest in our water and wastewater continues, or whether Congress now believes, as former President Nixon and Reagan highlighted in their vetoes of prior clean water bills, that the construction of wastewater infrastructure is the, quote, properly the responsibility of state and local governments, end quote. Today, trends on the federal investment in the nation's water-related infrastructure are, in my opinion, going the wrong direction. Recently, the Congressional Budget Office issued a report highlighting how the federal contribution towards addressing our nation's infrastructure was declining, and how state and local governments are forced, where possible, to make up the difference. The trend on a decreasing federal commitment to addressing our water infrastructure challenges reflect the trend on how the federal government provides its contribution to address these challenges. For example, in 1972, the Clean Water Act construction grants program covered 75% of the cost of constructing water infrastructure for all our needs. However, when President Reagan proposed to substitute the construction grants program from the Clean Water State Revolving Fund program, the result was that the federal contribution towards individual projects was reduced. This again compelled local communities to shoulder a greater share of the cost of the individual projects. Excuse me. More recently, when Congress created another financial mechanism, the Water Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act, WIFIA, again, the federal contributions toward the construction of individual projects was further reduced, and communities were again forced to look elsewhere to make up the difference. To be clear, each of these mechanisms for infrastructure investment grants, SRF loans, and federally leveraged private capital have a place in solving our water-related infrastructure crisis. Yet, I highlight brought a trend to make this point. As the administration and Congress continue to discuss potential mechanisms to address our crumbling infrastructure, we must recognize that the federal government is already contributing less towards the cost of individual projects today than just a few decades ago. Yet, there's no free lunch when it comes to solving our infrastructure crisis. When the federal government contributes less to the cost of these projects, somebody has to pick up the difference, and often that somebody is local government or municipality or the individual ratepayer that is already struggling to make ends meet. If we are serious about closing our water infrastructure needs gap, we must recognize the unique challenges facing all our individual communities. For those communities with financial capability to use WIFIA program or private capital, that may be the appropriate mechanism for addressing their local needs. However, we know that other communities continue to rely on mechanisms such as the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to obtain the financial assistance. To that end, the committee should quickly approve the legislation such as the Bipartisan Water Quality and Job Creation Act, which I co-sponsor with ranking member Mr. Vacio and Mr. Duncan of Tennessee, to reauthorize increased funding levels for this important program. For those communities that still have the affordability challenges using these existing mechanisms, we need to be more creative. We need to explore ways to target federal assistance to the neighborhoods or households least able to afford water and wastewater services. This will help communities meet their local infrastructure challenges in a way that does not disproportionately impact those least able to afford the cost. In addition, I am concerned that any forthcoming infrastructure proposal from this administration will be light on real infrastructure spending and heavy on gimmicks, such as environmental streamlining, that will do nothing to solve our infrastructure. That would be a significant missed opportunity. We will not be able to address our local water infrastructure with slogans that may sound like we're doing something, but in fact, we're not. Without question, our communities expect and demand safe and desirable water resources for their consumption, use, and enjoyment. Our responsibility to ensure that these communities have adequate, affordable resources to address these needs. And that is the end. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Napolitano. Before I begin introducing our witnesses this morning, allow me to dispense with some unanimous consent requests. I ask unanimous consent that written testimony submitted on behalf of the following be included in the hearing's record: the Association of Metropolitan Water Agencies, the American Public Works Association, a letter from the American Rivers and other conservation organizations, a joint letter from Computing Technology Industry Association, and Smart Cities Council, and Smart Waters Network Forum, Blue Green Alliance. Is there any objection? Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent the record remain open 15 days for additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Is there any objection? Without objection, so ordered. Ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open at such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I am going to have to leave this hearing early today, and I've asked the Vice Chair, Mr. Mass, to take over the chair at some point. I want to apologize to you for that. We have some conflicting committee business today, but I want to thank you all very much for being here. The first witness today is the Honorable Joy Cooper, the mayor of the city of Hallandale Beach, Florida. Mayor Cooper, I'm going to break, I'm sure, rules, protocol, and everything else. Just want to ask you very quickly, could you just give a quick update on how things are in your community from the impacts of Hurricane Irma?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Thankfully,
you can hold the clock for just a second.
Hallandale Beach is 98% recovered. We were very, very fortunate. We were on the brink of flooding, but weren't, and we're very fortunate. Unlike Brickell, the Keys will be hopefully up and running for business, believe it or not, in November, and we're recovering. Certainly, many communities still need assistance. You're right on point. And thank you very much for your kind comments to those that are suffering.
You bet. Look, I think I speak on behalf of every member of this committee on both sides when I say that we all stand ready to continue assisting, to find ways to help improve the efficiency of recovery efforts, and certainly continuing to keep your community and many others in our thoughts and prayers. But with that, please move forward with your testimony.
Thank you. Good morning, Chair Graves and Ranking Member Napolitano and members of this committee. My name is Mayor Joy Cooper. I'm the mayor of Hallandale Beach. I'd like to thank you for having this hearing today and inviting me to provide you with my city's perspective, as well as recommendations of the U.S. Conference of Mayors on rebuilding our water infrastructure. Hallandale Beach is a 90-year-old community in southeast Florida. We are 4.4 square miles with a population of 38,000 that swells to 50,000 during our winter season. Our annual budget is $110 million with a general fund of $70 million. A full evaluation of our infrastructure needs was conducted in 2014. That included underground and above ground infrastructure. The price tag is well over $200 million. We have committed over $12 million in our water supply and treatment systems, $30 million in the next 5 years on our sanitary sewers, and we plan on spending approximately $1 million per year to deal with sea level rise and associated flooding. The proposed city budget has increased various service fees from 10 to 51% to cover projected expenditures. In the case of stormwater management, the increase is 220%. With a median income of $24,000 and 15% of our residents living on $15,000 a year, the rising fees are difficult to afford. And there is a growing concern that those households unable to make payments will place a significantly greater burden on those that can. While we're committed to invest in substantial amounts on public water and sewer services, we have a glaring need to invest in resiliency measures. Hurricane Wilma-related flood impacted numerous main roads in our community and resulted in damages to many homes. In response, an extensive pumping system for 2 targeted areas with repetitive flood-related losses had to be designed and constructed at a cost of more than $25 million. We are currently constructing phase 2 of the project. To complete the project and maintain required the 220% increase in fees I mentioned earlier. This project would not have been possible with the help of FEMA, both in financial and technical consultation. This is the type of model of intergovernmental partnership that works best. Overall, local governments in Florida have invested over $88 billion in water and sewer from 2000 to 2014, $7.1 billion in 2014 alone. This amounts to investing $19.5 million every day. Sewer revenues increased 116% from 2000 to 2013, and water revenues increased 80% over the same time period. I just described my city and Florida's experiences and investments. In my written testimony, there is an outline of national needs along with how they should be determined, along with specific actions that would boost spending. But a major point, is local governments are by far the main investments in water and sewer, around 95 to 97%. We are trying to do our part, but it's clear that clearly it is not adequate to meet our nation's infrastructure needs without unduly burdening our citizens. We need a more robust infrastructure plan with more resources and tools. The Conference of Mayors has recently released a framework for addressing the nation's local infrastructure needs. We ask you to do the following: prevent any efforts to cap or limit tax-exempt municipal bonds. Allocate resources directly to cities and counties for priority water and sewer infrastructure projects that will support low and moderate income neighborhoods. Support the use of public-private partnerships. Amend the Internal Revenue Code to remove the state volume caps for private activity bonds used to finance public-purpose water and sewer facilities. Direct at least $5 billion in additional funding to low or no interest grants to state revolving funds. Codify integrated planning and affordability legislation in Mr. Gibbs' bill, H.R. 465. Build infrastructure that increases resiliency, and increase Army Corps of Engineers funding, and spend the full amount of Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund on its intended use. I again want to commend this committee for addressing this important issue, and I hope you are successful in passing a comprehensive infrastructure water bill. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Mayor. The next witness is James Proctor from McWane Incorporated. Mr. Proctor.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, and members of the subcommittee, good morning. My name is Jim Proctor with McWane, and thank you for the opportunity to testify about an issue vital to our nation's health, economy, and security. Water is our most precious resource, one that is essential to human health and life. Access to water depends upon a reliable water infrastructure system that preserves, treats, and delivers safe drinking water to our nation's communities. For almost 200 years, our team members at McWane have proudly provided the building blocks for our nation's water infrastructure, supplying products that transport clean water to communities and homes across the country. Despite its obvious importance, out of sight, out of mind best describes the nation's attitude toward water infrastructure. But the reality is that much of America's waste and water infrastructure is nearing the end of its useful life, and over $1 trillion is needed over the next 20 years to rebuild and rehabilitate these systems. However, our water infrastructure challenges cannot be solved simply by providing more federal funding. Rather, a fundamental shift away from the traditional approaches must occur through a combination of new sources of funding, greater accountability, and improved governance. For the past 9 months, an inclusive group of prominent associations in the water infrastructure sector have been working together to discuss and develop a set of ideas that could provide this positive and transformative change. The participants in these discussions include the spectrum of publicly and privately owned systems, rural and urban communities, and drinking and wastewater systems. This package of ideas the group has discussed is broadly organized around 3 themes. First, removing barriers to investment and better management. Second, funding. And third, innovation. And I'll discuss each of these in turn. Removing investment barriers. Water and wastewater services in the United States are delivered by more than 70,000 entities, over 80% of which serve fewer than 10,000 customers. In fact, 50% serve fewer than 500 customers. These small operators sometimes struggle to achieve the scale of operations and expertise necessary to meet the challenges that they face. Voluntary partnerships with other entities can help them scale up to develop the necessary financial, operational, and technical capacity to solve this problem. There are many paths to such partnering arrangements, including public-to-public, public-to-private, private-to-private, and public-to-public partnerships, as well as concessions, operating agreements, or even the consolidation of assets or services. But let me emphasize, nothing I say today should be construed as favoring one path over another. Rather, all paths should remain available at the discretion of the local entity. Such partnerships should be encouraged by, among other things, more financial incentives, a regulatory safe harbor, removing the defeasance penalty, encouraging effective utility management and best practices, including requiring full cost accounting, and empowering local decision-making. Congress should also increase federal funding for the water sector. Since the recession, annual appropriations for water infrastructure have been decreasing while the funding need has been increasing. To correct that unfortunate trend, Congress should extend WIFIA and increase its funding to $45 million. Increase funding to the state SRFs to $3 billion for each program, provide more technical assistance to small and rural systems, remove the volume cap on private activity bonds for water projects, retain tax exemptions for municipal bonds, and expand eligibility for SRF loans to private water providers. In addition to funding, Congress should help increase innovation by authorizing and funding the creation of a national water infrastructure testbed network and establish a national program for collaboration and the sharing of best practices among utilities. Congress should also task the Department of Labor with developing a workforce development program for water and wastewater systems of tomorrow. These ideas have all been discussed by the various water constituencies mentioned above, and in concept, they all enjoy the unanimous support of the group, subject to agreement on the actual legislative language. But I should point out that the consensus is the product of compromises that balance diverse perspectives and the resulting premise that all the various components are linked. These are only a few of the issues and solutions that merit discussion. The key takeaway, however, is that the scope and scale of America's water infrastructure needs require a forward-looking and creative response. Reform and reauthorization of the Clean Water Act programs like the SRFs and WIFIA are crucial to that effort, and we at McWane are glad to have the opportunity to contribute to that process. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Next witness is David Peterson from Los Virgeneses Municipal Water District. Mr. Peterson.
Good morning, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, and members of the subcommittee. My name is David Peterson, General Manager of Los Virgenes Municipal Water District in Calabasas, California. We are a municipal wastewater agency that serves about 100,000 people in western LA County. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on behalf of the California Association of Sanitation Agencies and the Association of California Water Agencies. CASA and ACWA represent hundreds of local agencies in California on water quality issues and drinking water needs. Today I will summarize 4 important issues that are described in more detail in my written testimony, which I ask be accepted for the record. First, CASA and ACWA ask the subcommittee to support a robust infrastructure funding partnership between the federal government and local communities, including both grants and loans. California and much of the nation face deteriorating infrastructure, increased regulatory compliance costs, unpredictable weather conditions, and general population growth. The US EPA State Revolving Loan Fund program right now is currently the most important and effective water infrastructure financing program available to local agencies. In fact, projects that were constructed with SRF funds, including and especially those for water recycling, were key and instrumental in reducing the impact of the statewide drought that we experienced in California. In addition to robust funding, we recommend that the subcommittee consider updating the formula that's used to allocate those limited funds to states. Moving to our second issue, we ask that the subcommittee extend National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits from 5 to 10 years. We believe this change would provide significant benefits to states and to the local public and wastewater agencies. In the 45 years that the program has been in place, NPDES permits have become increasingly complex, and the treatment technologies have become substantially more expensive and time-intensive to implement. As a result, many local agencies are faced with negotiating the terms for a new permit while they're still working to implement the improvements for their current permit. The 5-year term that was established in 1972 no longer reflects today's clean water challenges, and it is an obstacle for long-term planning. My agency is a prime example of the advantages of a 10-year permit. In July of 2013, the US EPA established a TMDL for our watershed that created some of the toughest nutrient standards in the entire country. Upgrades to our treatment plant were estimated to be in the neighborhood of $160 million. Through a stakeholder-driven process, we developed the Pure Water Project Las Virgenes Triunfo, a surface water augmentation project that provides a new source of drinking water for us and also meets our regulatory needs. The $95 million project is estimated to take 13 and a half years to complete, yet we'll be faced with renewing our NPDES permit every 5 years during that process. Sacramento Regional County Sanitation District experienced a similar challenge in that they were making over $1 billion in improvements to their treatment facilities when they were faced with a 5-year permit renewal. 10-year permit terms would give local water and wastewater agencies adequate time to comply with their existing regulatory requirements before new ones are imposed, and also states could direct their resources to higher priority issues. Importantly, the new 10-year permits would include the existing permit reopener provisions that allow new conditions to be addressed into the permit during the term of the permit. Third, CASA and AQUA support integrated planning as an effective means for public agencies to address multiple Clean Water Act requirements. We support proposals recognizing the value of integrated plans, particularly those that are developed by our colleagues at NACWA and in collaboration with the EPA. Integrated plans promote more comprehensive water planning while stretching limited local resources. And as our final request, we ask that Congress avoid proposals that include consolidation or reorganization of local water and wastewater agencies as a criterion for federal funding or to rank projects for federal funding. Consolidation may be appropriate in certain instances, but we believe these decisions are best left to the policymakers at the local level. In summary, we urge the subcommittee to maintain robust funding for the vital SRF program, extend NPDES permit terms to 10 years, support the use of integrated plans, and avoid consolidation or reorganization as a criterion for federal funding. Thank you for your consideration.
Thank you. Our next witness is David StPierre from the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. Mr. StPierre.
Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is David StPierre, and I'm the Executive Director of the Metropolitan Water Reclamation District of Greater Chicago. I also serve as Vice President of the National Association of Clean Water Agencies, which is a not-for-profit trade association that represents the interests of public clean water agencies nationwide. The need for greater investment in our nation's infrastructure, including water, is well known. Nationally, our nation's clean water infrastructure has received a D+ grade from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and the EPA calculates national investment needs to fully comply with Clean Water Act under current conditions at approximately $271 billion over the next 20 years. Those of us who work in this sector understand that the true investment needs are likely much higher. And while local clean water investments are often driven by federal statute or enforcement actions, over 90% of water investment in the U.S. is funded by local dollars. Earlier this year, then President-elect Trump called for a tripling of federal funding to the state revolving funds to help address water infrastructure investment needs. NACWA applauds this recognition of the important and successful role of the state revolving funds. We are grateful for the work the subcommittee has done to support strong SRFs. As discussions advance regarding federal infrastructure investment, it is imperative that the SRFs play a prominent role and that real investment dollars for water are on the table to ensure clean water gains continue to be made. Private investments facilitated by the Clean Water SRF may be appropriate in certain situations, but should not come at the expense of financing for publicly owned systems which serve the overwhelming majority of the U.S. sewered population. Another very timely area of interest to NACWA and its members is the potential for regionalization public-public, and public-private water utility partnerships to help advance clean water, particularly in areas where there are opportunities for economies of scale or sharing of resources and expertise. In the Chicago region, our agency provides technical and financial support to 125 communities in Cook County to address infrastructure needs and build resilient communities. These efforts have encouraged local community investment and collaboration and increased efficiency in addressing infrastructure needs. These regional efforts allow solutions to problems to local communities and decrease state and federal liabilities. Another element of sustainable long-term financial footing is moving toward full cost accounting. But given the complex and dynamic nature of this calculation, we do not support it as a barrier to the SRFs. Municipalities face enormous pressure to maintain rates based on the abilities of low-income households to pay, which can inhibit charging the full cost of the service provided or lead to deferred investments. A safety net for the lowest income households would better position utilities to charge rates that fully reflect the true cost of service and address the infrastructure investment gap. In addition, utilities need flexibility to addressing today's challenges. These challenges underlie why the clean water sector is encouraged by the U.S. EPA's integrated planning framework. The integrated planning approach provides communities an opportunity to consider their clean water obligations holistically, to develop compliance schedules that can maximize each ratepayer dollar, focus first on the investments that are of top priority for the community and environment, and ensure the greatest possible net environmental benefit is achieved. We greatly appreciate the work of the subcommittee has done to date on integrated planning and to address affordability concerns. We recognize Representative Gibbs, former chairman of the subcommittee who sponsored H.R. 465, the Water Quality Improvement Act. Similarly, we recognize several members of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, including subcommittee ranking members Napolitano, Representative Bustos, and Representative Smucker, co-sponsors of H.R. 2355, the Water Infrastructure Flexibility Act. These efforts signify nothing less than trying to bring the Clean Water Act into the 21st century. In closing, I would like to thank the subcommittee, Congress, and the administration for their focus on clean water infrastructure investment. I believe that investment in water is a nonpartisan issue which protects public health, the environment, creates jobs, and is essential for economic development. As Congress looks to advance the 21st century infrastructure for America, clean and safe water must be a top investment priority supported by a true local, state, and federal partnership.
Thank you, Mr. St. Pierre. I think you ended right at 5 minutes. Perfect timing. Our next witness is Mr. Hector Gonzalez, man, El Paso Water Utilities. Mr. Gonzalez.
Good morning, Chairman Graves and members of the subcommittee. My name is Hector Gonzalez. I'm here representing El Paso Water. El Paso Water provides water, wastewater, reclaimed water, and stormwater for the residents of El Paso and some of the surrounding areas. I'm also on the board of directors of the Association of Regional Water Organizations, which supports policies and infrastructure funding programs that will help regional water and wastewater systems in unserved and underserved communities. Thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts on key priorities for infrastructure legislation. The first of the priorities deals with how the Association of Regional Water Organizations is focused on how best to help rural water systems in unincorporated areas receive better service at a lower cost. Outside of the city limits of El Paso, approximately 35,000 people are not connected to a public wastewater system. An estimated $500 million is required to provide the needed connections. Laws prohibit our utility from spending ratepayer money outside the service area, but we have loaned expertise in partnered with to identify federal funding and manage projects. Various federal agencies have helped extend potable water service, but without wastewater connections, homes often have failing septic systems which pose a public health hazard. There are thousands of similar stories across rural America where communities are underserved and must rely on inadequate septic systems. There are an estimated 50,000 community water systems across the country, and all but the largest have a difficult time accessing capital, which prevents major infrastructure improvements from moving forward. These are challenges that need attention in the new infrastructure bill. Programs with federal matching grant funding are needed to fill these gaps. The Association of Regional Water Organizations sees regionalization through both private-public partnerships and public-public partnerships as the best solution to improve water resource planning and increase access to the capital. Through partnerships, we can fill the gaps and execute major capital investments that deliver results. The second priority that I'd like to focus on is water reuse. With the frequency of drought and growing challenges from declining freshwater resources, more and more communities are turning to impaired groundwater, wastewater, and stormwater to meet their future needs. El Paso Water is active with the Water Reuse Association, which represents various communities and effectively advocates for policies and funding to increase water reuse. They emphasize the value of water reuse as a safe, reliable, locally controlled water supply that protects the environment, sustains economic growth, and provides a high quality of life. Several decades ago, El Paso Water faced water scarcity fears, and yet because of our pioneering efforts in reuse and conservation, we're now considered a leader in water resource innovation. We have many communities throughout the arid West that will need to expand the reuse of water resources to ensure fresh water supplies for the future. I'll share two water reuse examples from my home city. El Paso Water owns and operates the K. Bailey Hutchison Desalination Plant. This is the largest inland desalination plant in the world. It provides a drought-proof supply for our city and also sometimes serves the needs of Fort Bliss. We'll need to significantly expand this plant in the future. In another reuse project, El Paso plans to build an advanced water purification facility that will transform wastewater into high-quality drinking water and send it directly to our customers. Both of these water reuse projects are expensive at about $100 million apiece, but both are essential to the future water supply. Many other communities face similar challenges, and with federal funding opportunities, these types of projects can move forward, spur innovation, and ultimately bring down the cost for water reuse overall. Very briefly, I'd like to mention a couple of final considerations. That is that El Paso has partnered with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers on various stormwater projects. Infrastructure legislation should expand core funding for dams and flood control systems. New focus areas should include the capture and treatment of stormwater for reuse. Military-based partnerships are also those that with local water utilities deserve attention. El Paso Water provides 100% of the wastewater service to Fort Bliss, and infrastructure at times serves municipal and military-based purposes and would benefit from federal funding program opportunities. Finally, I would encourage streamlining of regulatory requirements, especially related to water reuse, and simplifying the federal funding application process. Excessive delays could be removed with a new one-stop approach of pre-qualification based on a master application and a single comprehensive review. In closing, continued utility innovation success depends on partnership with federal government agencies and the ability to obtain funding assistance for innovation projects. Thank you for your opportunity to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Gonzalez. Our next witness is Mr. Christopher Franklin from Aqua America. Mr. Franklin.
Thank you, Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, and members of the subcommittee. I am Chris Franklin, and I'm President and CEO of Aqua America and President-elect of the National Association of Water Companies, on whose behalf I speak today. The NAWC is the association that represents regulated water and wastewater industry. In many ways, our companies operate water utilities in the same way that large gas and electric utilities operate. NAWC members are located throughout the nation and range in size from multi-billion-dollar companies to some smaller and more localized water utilities. The company I lead is called Aqua America, and it's a water and wastewater utility that serves about 3 million people in 8 states across the country. In fact, we have operations in at least 7 members' districts of this subcommittee. I'd like to focus my time today on the actions the federal government can take to unleash solutions to meet the nation's significant water and wastewater infrastructure needs. Now, as a result of our size and our management strategies, regulated water utilities are able to take advantage of economies of scale. Spreading the cost of infrastructure improvements, operating costs, and billing and customer service over more people creates a benefit for customers. Now, on a typical 3-year cycle, Aqua America spends over $1 billion in capital replacing water and wastewater pipe. Over the last decade, we replaced an average of 130 miles of water main each year. Due to the large amount of pipe we purchase, we can buy pipe at bulk prices considerably lower than many other utilities. And by the way, all of this work has dropped the frequency of our main breaks to far less than the national average. Now, you know very well the challenges faced by small and mid-sized city mayors: public safety, human services, streets. For a mayor, finding capital dollars to replace water and wastewater mains underground where nobody will take notice is a challenge. We understand these political and financial challenges facing elected officials, and frankly, it's one of the reasons we believe that NAWC can be part of the solution. Today, the annual appropriation for the Clean Water and Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Funds are approximately $2 billion. Importantly, the 6 largest members of our association collectively are spending $2.7 billion every year on their systems. So for the committee's consideration, I'd like to talk about 2 policies that would lead to more efficiencies. The first recommendation is the federal government should incentivize partnerships in the water sector. Let's face it, there are more than 50,000 water systems in the country and 16,000 different wastewater systems. I've been an executive and a board member of water and electric utilities now for more than 2 decades. And I can tell you that without economies of scale, it is tough to be viable in the utility business in any length of time. That's one of the reasons why most environmental agencies and public utility commissions have long ago adopted policies to encourage consolidation of water and wastewater systems. Incentivizing partnerships and consolidation is the policy we recommend to you today. I want to acknowledge my colleagues on the panel and across the municipal sector for the fine work they do. There are many well-run municipal systems, particularly in larger towns and cities where economies of scale are apparent. But within those 65,000 water and wastewater systems, there are also many smaller systems that continue to struggle. Now, the second recommendation that we'll make is that federal government mandate effective utility management and require financial viability and accountability for performance. Non-compliant water and wastewater systems not only create a growing financial burden, but they pose significant risks to public health and the environment. According to the EPA, there are presently thousands of domestic wastewater systems that are in significant non-compliance. These failing systems should not be subsidized with federal dollars without demonstrating a path toward long-term financial and operational viability. We recommend that all applicants for public dollars demonstrate that they have fully accounted for the long-term costs of their projects, including any risks inherent in construction, operations, and maintenance costs. I appreciate the invitation to appear before the subcommittee today, and at the appropriate time, be happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Our last witness is Mr. Lawrence Levine from the Natural Resources Defense Council. Mr. Levine, thank you for being here. You recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good morning. Chairman Graves, Ranking Member Napolitano, and members of the subcommittee. I'm Lawrence Levine, a senior attorney with Natural Resources Defense Council. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. First-class infrastructure to protect clean water and public health is among our most basic and most important needs as a nation. Yet in much of the country, our aging infrastructure is simply not up to the twin tasks of providing everyone with access to the safe water and sewer services they need and keeping our waterways free of harmful pollution. Too many communities, both large and small, urban and rural, the public is still drinking water with contaminants that pose serious health risks from systems that leak a substantial portion of the water they produce. Meanwhile, sewage and polluted runoff make our waters both unsafe for human use and too degraded to support the fisheries and natural habitat we need for sustenance, recreation, and natural flood mitigation. The effects of climate change, droughts, floods, storms, sea level rise, all threaten to degrade or damage our water infrastructure even further, as the devastation caused by Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria over the last month so drastically illustrate. To protect our communities and our natural environment, there is a critical need for major new investments in water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure. Critically, the scale of the need is so vast that without a large and lasting commitment of new funds from the federal government, leveraged with additional funds from the states, our communities simply will not be able to fund the investment they need so badly to bring their water systems into the 21st century. Major new federal investments, like all of our nation's infrastructure investments, can be deployed to simultaneously deliver economic, social, and environmental benefits, spur innovation in clean and efficient water and energy systems, invest in climate-resilient infrastructure projects and smart technology, ensure accountability for every dollar, allocate flexible funding for local and regional planning, and create good, forward-looking jobs beyond the construction phase of infrastructure projects. For water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure funding specifically, NRDC also urges Congress to embrace a number of key principles, including the following. Expand the state revolving funds and leverage additional investment by states and local governments. Direct new funds to natural and nature-based infrastructure solutions. Ensure that projects are designed, sited, and built with the full consideration of the future impacts of climate change. Ensure that communities and families in the greatest need are not left behind. Amplify benefits to the economy by incorporating Buy American domestic sourcing requirements, prevailing wage provisions, and green job opportunities. Based on these overarching points, NRDC offers the following specific priority recommendations to Congress. First, increase funding and improve use of existing funding. Increase the current annual appropriations to the SRFs to $6 billion, which would mark a return to a similar level adjusted for inflation as was appropriated under President Reagan for the Clean Water SRF alone. And it would be the level the President promised during last year's campaign. Direct the additional funds to water use efficiency, green infrastructure, stormwater capture and reuse, hardship communities, source water protection, nutrient reduction, lead service line replacement, water loss control, and climate resilience. Provide incentives to states to leverage federal funds and invest more state dollars in water infrastructure by allowing states that exceed the minimum required match for federal SRF capitalization grants to distribute a larger share of their SRF funding as grants rather than loans. Reauthorize and improve the Sewer Overflow Control Grant Program under Clean Water Act Section 122. Improve implementation of existing requirements, which Congress enacted in 2014, that promote the use of water efficiency, recapture, and reuse strategies in clean water SRF-funded projects. Second, ensure that water and sewer service remains affordable for low-income households, even as utilities generate additional local revenue to meet clean water needs. This includes prioritizing disadvantaged communities in water infrastructure grant programs, creating a federal low-income water and sewer assistance program analogous to the LIHEAP program for energy to help maintain affordable costs at the household level, and using federal policy to spur creation of complementary state and local assistance programs to promote more equitable water and sewer rate structures and to increase utilities' use of asset management, green infrastructure, and water efficiency strategies that reduce costs for all customers. Third, reinstate the federal flood risk management standard to protect the value of federal water infrastructure investments by reducing the risk of severe damage and flooding disasters, as S 1798 would do, introduced 2 weeks ago. Fourth, support tools for effective prioritization of pipe replacement and leakage control, as in Title III of H.R. 3275. And finally, preserve and strengthen source water protections, including the Clean Water Rule, to protect health and reduce treatment costs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Levine. I have a couple of quick questions, and Mr. Masson and I are going to switch up here. I'm curious, we can sit here and talk for hours about the need for federal resource needs in water and wastewater. And it seems as though the federal government's role has continued to grow and evolve over time. As we focus on building a new infrastructure package, a new infrastructure approach at the federal level, one of the things that I believe we need to do is we need to determine what the federal objectives of this infrastructure package is. What are the federal priorities? And then to develop effective criteria or metrics for us to advance those and actually complete those objectives, as opposed to taking a shotgun type approach where we throw a nickel at every $10 problem across the country. I'm curious if, Mayor Cooper, could you reflect a little bit on what you view the federal government's role is in water and wastewater infrastructure?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Over the past 10 years, I'm working with integrated planning and looking at what we can do. I believe that in my testimony and my written testimony and the suggestions that we can move forward is really work on the SRF funds and free up some more money as far as grants. We've been focused on that as well. I think that would help offset a lot of the affordability. Also, as far as integrated planning, give the timeframes that many of the members have suggested here. And many times, it's about integrated planning, fair and equitable distribution of the funds, and the SRF plan that we're asking to fund, and the other list of recommendations from the U.S. Conference of Mayors.
Anyone else care to quickly comment on that, on what you see the federal government's role being in water and wastewater investment? Mr. Franklin?
Mr. Chairman, I would suggest, as well as you could, encourage partnerships. Partnerships within municipals, partnerships between municipal and investor-owned regulated utilities. The more we can bring economies of scale to bear, where we can handle these heavy costs over more people and spread that cost more widely, I think long-term we get rate stability. And certainly there's a role for federal dollars, certainly there's a role for the federal government, but the encouragement of these partnerships, I believe, is critical.
Thank you. You know, being a recovering non-federal sponsor with many water projects in South Louisiana, one of the challenges we had was the federal government would say, okay, here's an area where we can participate, but the certainty associated with their funding stream was always very unpredictable. And so my 2 cents, it seems as though if we can move a direction of better prioritizing what the federal government's role is in improving predictability of certainty of the funding, that's going to provide a much better situation for folks trying to implement water and wastewater projects at the state and local level. Ms. Levine, I want to ask you a question toward the end. You made reference to the Federal Flood Risk Management Standard. This is something I struggled with. If you're going to tell communities that they cannot rebuild, for example, Mayor Cooper's state, that they cannot rebuild or invest any federal funds unless they meet a 500-year standard or the alternatives that were in place, yet FEMA is not allowed to compensate you for that higher or more resilient standard, how do you recover a community that is already challenged with recovery, with perhaps in the case of Florida, billions and billions of dollars in recovery, loss of taxes, loss of property values and things along those lines? It seems like you're actually throwing a curveball to a community that's already undermined. And this isn't a curveball question. I really am curious about this because I've struggled with this question for over a year now.
Sure, thanks for the question. So in our view, it's really a common sense approach, right? If we're going to, and it goes to your question really of prioritization and how we're going to spend federal dollars in the most effective way, right? If we're putting federal dollars towards projects that are likely to see the same damage over and over again from floods, from larger storms that, as we all know, are more likely to occur more frequently over the future, and we've already been seeing that. If we put federal dollars towards that and don't design those projects in a way that's resilient to minimize or avoid that flood risk damage, that flood risk, it's not a wise use of federal funds. And so there's simply a need to find the right project built in the right way to serve those local needs, but it doesn't serve either the needs of the federal government or the needs of the local community if things are rebuilt in ways that are not going to be resilient and be continually able to function and provide those basic local services.
Thank you. My point, I mean, everyone I think supports resilience. The problem is without the corresponding resources for a community that's already dealing with recovery, then you're going to be unable to rebuild your community. If you're requiring that rebuilding occur at a higher standard, you're going to be unable to rebuild your community without the corresponding resources. So I'm just concerned, I'm out of town, but just concerned about the relationship there, and I think we need to think through this a little bit more. But with that, I want to thank you all very much. I have some other questions we're going to submit in writing to you, and would appreciate your responses there, but I'm going to recognize Mr. Napolitano and going to switch with Mr. Mass. So thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In my opening statement, I did express some concern about recent trends on how Congress provides federal assistance to wastewater infrastructure projects. Several of you noted, rightfully, that the federal share of individual projects has been decreasing over time to a point, some of you noted, that government invests less than 10% of annual water and sewer capital costs. Several of you also note that the current mix of federally subsidized loans and leveraged federal financing does not work for every community. Is it time for Congress to rethink the trend, as my colleague has stated, envision a renewed federal water wastewater program to address the infrastructure needs of communities facing affordability concerns, such as those with lower income populations or smaller or rural communities. Also, the federal government played a significant role in financing the first generation of water and wastewater systems. Immediately following the enactment of Clean Water Act, is it time for us to renew the role for certain communities to implement in the next generation of projects? Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Ranking Member Napolitano. Good question, and in California, we certainly support efforts to look at affordability for water and also affordability and investment in disadvantaged and economically challenged areas. We believe that there is a great need for grant programs to continue. We recognize that the funding landscape has changed dramatically, and loans are actually a very valuable tool, the SRF program. But in addition, grants for those economically challenged areas we think is very helpful to both fund their capital needs and perhaps in the future O&M needs. With regard to this Safe and Clean Drinking Water Revolving Fund, as my colleagues on the panel have urged the subcommittee, increased levels of funding are very important. We're really on our third, perhaps even our fourth cycle of improvements since the adoption of the Clean Water Act, and those improvements are becoming more expensive and more time intensive to implement, and so that funding is vital to support our local agencies.
Mr. StPierre.
So I think lower income concerns are a major issue and a barrier for full price for water. I think at the federal level, it really would be helpful for some kind of a program, whether it's a water ratepayer assistance program, to make water affordable. I think that at the local level, if we could charge full load pricing, a lot of these things become a lot more affordable, but that is the issue. It's lower income concerns that really keep water from that full load price. Also, I do believe in partnerships with other communities. Chicago, we do provide grant programs for disadvantaged communities. The economy of scale issue, I have 5 million customers. I certainly can afford a lot more than a system that has 100,000 customers. So I can afford that kind of help. I think that economy of scale issue needs to be looked at, and the regionalization of water needs to be considered in a variety of venues.
Ms. Cooper.
Thank you, Ranking Member Napolitano. I believe there's a place with public-private partnerships as far as the one thing that it needs to be looked at is community by community. That's why we've been focused on this integrated planning. For example, in Florida, we actually share a municipal service with a municipal service district with 5 other communities, but our water is independent. So when you're looking at this, we've been looking at least being granted the ability to address it on a local demand need. As far as the affordability, again, going back to my statements and the presentation on the evaluation, we don't want to displace those costs on the people that can afford. I believe that ties into a grant system that we should go back to the original, so wisely put in your presentation and your questions in regards to going back to a mix of grants and state revolving fund increases. I don't think there's another way to avoid the displacement of some of those costs without some kind of program. As such is your recommendation.
Mr. Franklin.
Thank you, Ranking Member Napolitano. I guess I would make one point. I'd like to see access to the state revolving loan funds for clean water available to all. A lot of people are under the misconception that companies like mine, utilities, can make money on low interest, and that's a fallacy. The reality is public utility commissions only allow us to pass through interest. And since all federal taxpayers pay into these through their taxes, we should allow all federal taxpayers, including customers of utilities, to access these low interest funds.
Thank you, Ms. Chair.
And now we're going to go to my friend and fellow bomb technician, Representative Crawford.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. I have a couple of unique challenges. They're not necessarily unique to my district, but it's unique to rural geographies, and that is small towns, rural communities, remote areas where it's difficult to fund wastewater treatment systems and things of that nature. I've suggested sort of working collectively with small communities in a given area, and just would like to get some feedback from you and on the panel if anybody wants to weigh in on this. You know, in a municipal area, obviously a metropolitan area, you have funding mechanism that exists. How do we drive funding for a scenario that I just described along the lines of what a metropolitan area has, given the population challenges that we have? I certainly think that consolidation is one approach, but does anybody want to address the funding and the consolidation? Mr. StPierre, you look like you have something on your mind.
Yeah, one of the things we're working with US EPA on is a peer-to-peer network for smaller communities, and instead of an enforcement type program with the states for small communities, being able to bring in technical support from larger utilities that can help those utilities really put together a plan for their infrastructure, also be able to access SRF funds, which really for smaller communities, if they don't have technical expertise, can be quite difficult, and really help put them on a platform. We have a meeting with a lot of utility leaders next Sunday in US EPA to really look at this model and see if there can be a support service that's supported from a national level, created at a state level, where we can provide value to rural communities.
Mr. Gonzalez.
Yes, in the case of El Paso, we have some funding challenges to deal with. We expect to, within the city of El Paso, spend well over $1 billion over the next 10 years just to be able to serve our customers within the city. But we also have some challenges in trying to help many of the small communities that are located outside the city. We've got a long history of working with various federal agencies, but many times some of the regulations that are in place prohibit us from being able to apply directly for funds for some of these small communities. We've got one specific example that comes to mind, an area that has about 1,200 connections or so. The area already receives water service, but has a lot of failing septic systems, and the cost to be able to serve this particular area is well over $30 million or so. So it's impossible for the residents to be able to pay for the needed service. The utility can't provide the service, and the federal government is saying that because of the regulations that are in place, we're not able to apply to be able to ultimately serve them, and so they're kind of caught in the middle. So being able to address those kinds of regulations and to be able to capitalize, if you will, on utilities such as ours that have a willingness to go out and spend some of our own resources in terms of management and identifying funds and applying for funds would go a long ways.
Let me ask you this. Population of El Paso, roughly?
We've got about 800,000
800,000
residents within the...
How far out are you reaching into some of those outlying areas that's reasonably accessible logistically?
Well, we're designated as the regional planner and regional provider of service, and so we go within a couple of miles from the state line to New Mexico, and probably, I would say 5 to 7 miles. We provide some retail service and also some wholesale accounts that we have. But those areas that kind of fall, like I said, in between not being organized and not having the resources, we're willing to help. But again, in dealing with some of the federal agencies, our hands are tied because we don't qualify for getting this assistance.
What would it take for you to expand that range to 50 miles, 60 miles? Is that possible? Logistically feasible? Can you do that?
I don't know if it's feasible going that far, but we're looking at much closer areas. Like I said, the area I just mentioned is only probably 5 miles or so from the closest line, and yet you know, they're in need of $30 million or so just to be able to serve this very small area. Overall, like I said, just in wastewater needs, the majority of the funds that are needed are for rehabilitation with some new infrastructure in place.
So in the challenge, I guess, that we face in my district in particular is that many of the small towns, 200 population, less than 1,000, most of the time of the year, there's going to be boil orders that are issued just for drinking water, just for use in the home, and it's a quality of life issue, and it's a challenge for us going forward. So I appreciate your insights, and I look forward to working with you in the future with some more ideas how we can address that need, and I yield back. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Crosspert. Ms. Esty, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the chairman and ranking member for holding today's important hearing. I wanted 3 topics I really wanted to touch on today, one of which I added because of the enlightening conversation between Mr. Levine and the chairman, and that has to do with resiliency of water infrastructure. My state of Connecticut was hit very hard with Superstorm Sandy. We expended considerable resources in rebuilding and learning about more resilient infrastructure, about how to absorb fast-flowing water, work done in part at the institution that Mr. Levine attended, where he was one of my husband's students at the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies. And that does cost money. And my state spent that money to do so, and so did New York. And so I think in the interest of saving lives and saving dollars, it is incumbent on us to do that, because it's not only a misuse of dollars, but much more importantly, it's not using the best learning about how we save lives and save property going forward. So I would just say that I think we have to find a way to do that, and it would be wrong for the folks in Texas and in Florida and in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands not to take best practices forward, and we're just going to have to figure out a way to do it. And we shouldn't lower standards and put people's lives at risk and their property. So I think that's not only being stewards of the federal tax dollars, but recognizing other states have figured out a way to do that and didn't get extra support. We did it because it's the right thing to do. The 2 topics I really wanted to touch on were about public drinking water and about brownfields. On public drinking water, my state is one of the many in the country that has found we have unacceptable lead levels in our schools, in condominiums, in apartment buildings, in state office buildings. As you may know, we found recently in the Cannon office building that we had unacceptable lead levels and had to shut down all of the water fountains there. So this is a problem we're going to need to address, and it costs real money. And with aging infrastructure, it has to happen. We saw it in Flint, we saw it in Toledo, and as a co-chair of the Corrosion Prevention Caucus, I would urge us to look at that, and I'll ask a couple of you specifically about that, because there just is too much at stake. We can't afford to poison our people, especially not our children, and too many of these in our schools, and we will never recoup their lost ability, and it's just wrong. We need to figure out how to do that. And the other is on brownfields, which is part of this portfolio as well. I want to thank the ranking member, Chairman Graves, who we've been working hard on a bill, have one that passed unanimously out of committee, and we're hoping to get it to the floor soon. But nearly 1/3 of the projects don't get funded because EPA doesn't have sufficient funding. 2 of those projects were in my district, and they're important projects. There are 533 that didn't make the cut last time, not because they didn't qualify, not because they weren't good projects, but because simply we didn't have enough money. So sometimes, unfortunately, it does take money. We're making some improvements, to Mr. Franklin's point and to Mayor Cooper's point about trying to do P3s, public-private partnerships, where appropriate. We've learned from practices working with the League of Cities and with the mayors to improve the bill, and we'd urge your support and try to get this through to the floor soon. But again, we would like to see more robust funding for EPA for these programs, and then we can leverage the private dollars. So maybe, Mr. Peterson, you talked a little bit about if you can opine both on brownfields with some additional funding, recognizing that leverages a lot. Every one of those dollars leverages a lot. And on lead, what you're seeing in our water systems on lead. Thanks very much.
Sure, absolutely. Good questions. Lead is a major challenge across the country. Fortunately, on the West Coast, we don't have as severe a lead problem because a lot of our pipelines are not lead base pipes, but I think absolutely you're exactly right. We can't be having lead levels exceeding standards, especially in our schools. California has been very proactive in this. In fact, the legislature just passed a bill that actually increased the current federal standards for lead and copper testing, whereby community water systems would actually pay to do testing of schools, which is not currently a requirement. The other thing is corrosion control. It's very effective. It's cost effective. It does not require necessarily replacement of all the lead pipes, but if you can control corrosion and ensure that you're building that layer of deposit on the pipes and not leaching out lead. And with regard to the funding, I agree 100%. We need more robust funding. The funding can be leveraged at the local level. It should be. And then with regard to resiliency, in California, it's an issue that we're very aware of. We have situations where we face both drought emergencies and flood emergencies simultaneously. And so we need to be thinking of both, and we frequently focus on drought, but flood is also an issue that we need to be very aware of and prepare for. And we are doing that, though we need to do more.
I see my time has expired. Thank you. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Esty. Going to Texas, Mr. Babin, the questioning is yours.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate it. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here as well. Water issues are a huge issue. In Texas, it's an enormous issue. And as you know, countless communities across our country, and in my district in particular, 9 counties that I represent in southeast Texas, from Houston to Louisiana, have been impacted by devastating hurricane force winds. And it's not just my district. We had 39 counties impacted, not just my 9. But just to give you a little perspective, Hurricane Harvey set a new continental U.S. rainfall record of 51.88 inches in Crosby, Texas, and Harris County just a few weeks ago. Can you explain what practices and methods that you all have learned in your collective experiences have learned, especially since Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2005, to ensure that our drinking water infrastructure maintains its reliability after the storms like the ones we've just seen, where literally trillions of gallons of water inundate our communities in just a matter of a few days. And I would just like to open it up to the entire panel. Mr. Proctor.
Yes, sir. Thank you. One of the first things that needs to happen, and it's something I alluded to in my testimony, is life cycle costing and full cost accounting. Many of the groups that are represented here today joined in something called the Effective Utility Management Practices book, which talks about the need to understand what your full life cycle costs as you operate a utility. And once you understand those costs, then you can make investment decisions about how best to preserve those assets and make certain that they will serve for a long period of time. And you know, when you talk about resiliency in the context of storm events and so forth, that's one of the factors that needs to be taken into account. You need to look forward and try and anticipate what the frequency of storms might be, what the impacts might be, and include that in your cost calculation in designing the infrastructure that you build. And then certainly make certain that when you build that infrastructure that you try and build with the most resilient designs, resilient materials, and everything else so that they'll withstand those sorts of events.
Thank you very much. Anyone else like to? Mr. Franklin.
Yeah, Congressman, this is a critical issue and a lot of learnings. We had a lot of customers in your district. Many were on boiled water most recently. And I think there are several things that can be done, especially in serving rural communities, which is largely what we serve in Texas and North Carolina and other states. But number one, monitoring systems should be installed on as many of these systems as possible, so you know when they're down remotely. Secondly, staging of generators, pre-storm work, right? Generators should be staged to make sure that those wells, those community water systems and wastewater systems are operational as long as possible, even though they're remote and difficult to get to many times. And third, as many mutual aid discussions that we can have with other utilities to back each other up. The electrics have had it for many years. We don't have quite the same system in place for water and wastewater, but those mutual aid discussions are really important. I'll give you one example, Beaumont, Texas. We sent a team down there, and we were in Beaumont, and that was a very difficult situation, but we were able to put our expertise
That's my
and our water.
hometown. That's where I grew up.
Yes, sir. They had real trouble, right? 118,000 people out of water.
Absolutely. And many people, we lost power and water in many of our communities. And when you talk to folks, they will tell you, if I had to choose, I'd rather lose my electricity than lose my water. And I can agree with that because we experienced that. Thank you, Mr. Franklin. Anybody else like to add to that? Yes, ma'am.
If I may, I didn't get a chance to add because I didn't go back as far. About 10 years ago, we actually built a water plant for about $25 million. We have water independence in our city. It was one thing that I was steadfast against. We support, as U.S. Conference of Mayors, all our public-private partnerships. But I should have started with, I'm sorry for your struggles and your losses there.
Thank you.
It's not an easy situation, especially if you're not familiar with it. But there's a lot of lessons learned as U.S. Conference of Mayors. I assure you, we've been working with your mayors and look forward to working with you if you have any questions to help on resiliency and building out equipment. Being from Florida, we have a lot of experience in it as well. And our president, Mitch Landrieu, of course, is here to help as well.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Mr.
Thank you,
Chairman.
sir.
I think I'll yield back to balance my time, and I want to thank every one of you for your experiences and your advice.
Thank you, Mr. Babin. Mr. Lowenthal, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And first, I want to echo the comments of the ranking member Napolitano and many of the panelists also, and I want to thank the panelists for being here, about how important the Clean Water State Revolving Fund to water agencies, especially water agencies in California and across. And I think that we, as my own 2 cents, that we should be moving legislation like H.R. 2510 to reauthorize the VITAL program and provide direct investments in wastewater infrastructure. But I want to follow up on some things that the panelists said from my own understanding about what are the benefits and maybe some of the problems. And Mr. Peterson, I'm going to start with you. You advocated in your testimony an amendment to the Clean Water Act to allow for the 10-year permits under the NPDES, I think it was, and you talked about how, some of the rationale why Aqua would like to have it. I'd like to hear a little bit more, but I want to also hear, are there any downsides? I mean, you've promoted the upside of why it would be better for investments and other, but are there any issues involved that we should be addressing if we go from 5 years to 10 years in those permits? Are there problems that are there unintended consequences?
We've looked at that issue. We don't believe that there are, and
Okay.
we have not heard those, and we're open to listening. But we think really there's 3 key benefits of doing this. One is the longer 10-year terms promote, we think, a more efficient regulatory process while recognizing and preserving the water quality protections under the Clean Water Act, which is important. We also believe that it encourages longer-term planning and thinking, which is something we all need to do now, and every panelist has spoken about that. And then third, it better aligns the investments that we're making in the 21st century in infrastructure with the timeframes that are needed. And so we think it accomplishes those 3 things and actually helps to make the process more efficient.
I want to follow up on that to Mr. Levine on that. NRDC has used the NPDES permit system to urge enforcement of the Clean Water Act to guard against contamination. Talking about that, how would a longer time frame affect enforcement and contamination safeguards? Because we have to balance these kinds of issues.
Yeah, thank you for the question. There are some serious downsides, and we very much oppose changing that 5-year term of permits, which has always been a core part of the Act, and you can look back to the legislative history of when the Act was first passed, was highlighted by the sponsors, by floor statements, as really a key thing. And the reason for that is that standards and technologies and water quality needs do in fact change over timeframes much shorter than 10 years. The entire scheme of the NPDES permitting program, not only for wastewater treatment plants, but for all dischargers, was to recognize and to have EPA focusing on improvements in technology and ensuring that the best pollution control measures are used and that we don't have a 10-year gap between when a permit's written and catching up to the next best technology. And similarly, our knowledge of water quality impairments of our water bodies changes over a period of 10 years, and the plans that we develop to clean up those water bodies changes over a period of 10 years. So, for example, the development of total maximum daily loads under Section 303D of the Clean Water Act. Those are basically pollution diets that identify how much reduction is needed from different pollution sources to a water body, right? And those plans have consequences for permitting. They require permits to then meet those pollution diets, those pollution load reductions. And if those permit cycles get extended to 10 years, we're going to see substantial delay in making those water quality improvements we needed. And I'll add, if I can, just two quick related points. It's been suggested that by allowing for reopeners of permits, that would solve this problem. We don't think that that really solves the problem. If the default is you've got 10 years and a permit, and there's no action-forcing mechanism to revisit that permit for 10 years, you're cutting out the public and you're cutting out EPA and undermining EPA's authority. Right, so whenever there is a permit renewal, the public has the opportunity to come in and seek further protections, which they do not have. Public cannot do a reopener, right? The state permitting authority has the sole power to do a reopener. Similarly, EPA can't come in the way that they exercise their oversight responsibilities. When a state has a draft permit, EPA has a role and a responsibility to review it, see if it complies with the act, and the authority to object and ensure the state strengthens it. So if you put these things off for 10 years, you're taking those key safeguards, checks and balances out of the process.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Lowenthal. Mr. Weber, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Mayor Cooper, I want to visit with you for a second. I was on city council for 6 years in the little town of Pearland back then, which had like 26,000 people. We had 20 police officers, by the way, and I knew them all. Now Pearland has grown to about 110,000, has 160 police officers, and I don't think anybody knows them all. But anyway, I've been through that growth spurt. So you're mayor of Hallandale Beach, Florida. I want to come back to your discussion, I think, with Dr. Babin. If I understood you correctly, you said that y'all went for water independence 10 years ago, and it cost $25 million. And you said you were against that? Did I hear that correctly?
No, I was in full support of it.
You were supporting it. Okay, you were for that. Well, I'm sorry, I misunderstood that. And how long have you been mayor?
I've been mayor 14 years.
14 years. So you started when you were like in 6th grade?
Well, thank you for that kind remark.
Sure. We instituted what's known as an impact fee for people moving into Pearland. We're south of Houston. I'm not there now, but that's where I grew up, in that area. At a rapid rate, Pearland was one of the fastest growing cities in the country. And so we realized that it was the people coming to our little sleepy neighborhood town was going to have an impact on sewer systems, on our water system, on infrastructure, fire, police, EMS, roads, and so on and so on. Do y'all use an impact fee?
Well, you're a smart mayor for doing that, and we.
Well, I was never said I was mayor. I was
I'm
city
sorry.
council.
Oh,
Yeah,
council.
sure.
Well, we're all equal. I run a meeting, so.
Right.
But we do have impact fees, and we do, any new development pays their fair share of the impacts that they are, putting it on our community.
Mm-hmm.
We're actually in the process, I run a tight ship, so we just did our full evaluation of our basis of design report, which is that $200 million price tag. So if you're going to come up and do business, we want you to be a community partner, and you'll be paying your fair share into our community.
I noticed, according to Wikipedia, and if it's on Wikipedia or on Facebook, it's true.
I'm sorry.
Your 2010 census was 37,113 people. Their estimate of 2016 was 39,500 people. So you've grown by just a couple thousand people in the last 6 years. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Okay. Does the state play a role in y'all's development, state of Florida?
We actually have a robust, comprehensive plan through the Broward County District. We have a county seat that does planning, and we actually are very involved. I actually put all our growth management tools in the toolbox about 10 years ago, so we're pretty independent
Okay.
when it comes to approving development now.
Okay.
Can I speak to that question about the impact fees real briefly?
Yes, sir, feel free.
Thanks. So it really speaks to a broader issue about equitable rate structures, right? For the reasons you said, if you've got folks coming in, development coming in, they should be paying their fair share into that. The question of affordability of water and sewer service for residential customers, we've got the assistance, the low-income assistance approach, which is necessary, like the LIHEAP type approach, right, that we've talked about, federal assistance for that, state assistance for that to help reduce bills directly. But you've also got the underlying rate structure, right? So if you're giving somebody a credit or a voucher to help pay their bill, what was the bill to begin with, right? And what was the rate structure that resulted in that bill?
And who pays that difference?
Yeah, sure, that's right. I mean, that's providing the assistance, right? But if the rate structure itself is equitable, that's going to mitigate the amount of outside assistance that's needed. And so just to take an example, what I mean by that. So if you've got tiered rates for water, right, inclining block rates, where those who use just enough for their basic needs are paying a relatively lower per gallon price, and those who are profligate water users are paying a higher per gallon price for those higher increments. That's going to support folks of modest means who use modest amounts of water and lower their bill simply by changing the way the rate is structured in the first instance. And you see the same dynamic with the use of stormwater fees, for example, based on impervious area, where you get people paying in corresponding to the contribution of runoff they have into a system, and that will help residential customers quite often.
So it's safe to say, and I'm running out of time, that calculation, that formula doesn't take into account two things, perhaps: old, outdated equipment, lead pipes or others, whatever happens, and then also disasters like hurricanes and stuff. Is that safe to say?
Sure. Well, that gets to the full cost pricing, full cost accounting issue, right? Is making sure that whatever the rate structure is, that it's applied in a way that generates the total amount of revenue needed for the utility. And that in turn links with how much outside assistance the utility is getting for those capital costs, which underscores the need for federal and state investment. So that it's a set of puzzle pieces that all fit together, right? The utility needs to be able to generate revenue for its share, needs to be able to do it in an equitable way, but that share also needs to be not so outsized that it's impossible to do that, and the way to keep it from getting so outsized is to make sure that the financial assistance is coming in from the federal and state level where it's needed.
Well, we'll have that discussion later, Mr. Chair. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Ms. Lawrence, it's all you.
Thank you so much. As a former mayor, I just really want to say we should listen to our mayors who are dealing with this issue every day. It's amazing. When there are crises, you always see the mayor as the go-to person to deal with the crisis. Let's get the mayors involved, make sure their voices are heard to prevent some of these disasters. So let's talk about the data that we should. We heard my former colleague, Mayor Cooper, talk about the basis of design support. Enable for us to truly address the issue of water infrastructure in our country, we need data. It should be mandatory that every city conducts this type of review of their water infrastructure. So many of us will, as we talk about investment in our infrastructure, water should be a priority. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I represent Michigan. And what we went through with Flint and across the country, it was a shock to us to understand that water is not a luxury. It is a need to live. And it is not something that should be predicated upon the wealth of your community. So there is some things that I think we really need to have on point. Water main breaks. People used to ask me as a mayor, what keeps you awake at night? It was not things that you think about potholes. Yes, I didn't like the potholes, and I got beat up a lot about it. But water main breaks, when you flush your toilet, when it rained, was it going to back up in your basement? Those things kept me awake at night. It's a quality of life issue. We have 240,000 water main breaks. And what we're doing, we're wasting 2 trillion gallons of treated drinking water. And there's communities who are struggling right today in America to get clean drinking water, going through the conservation issues that you talked about, Mr. Gomez, to just survive and have water quality, and we're wasting it every single day. Army Corps of Engineers have a backlog of $56 billion. And what does that include? The levees and the dams that are breaking every time we have these natural disasters and coastal inlands. These are issues that we must make water infrastructure. So, Mr. Levin, I want to ask you this question, Mr. Levine. Across the country, we are now dealing with this water issue affordability with low-income communities. How do we create a 21st century water infrastructure that ensures that we are in America, as we talk about health care and tax structure, that the basic human need of water is being addressed?
Thanks. So there are many legs to the stool, right? It's a combination. What we do really need in order to make sure that at the level of an individual household, of every individual household, that there's that access to affordable water and sewer and stormwater service, right, is to make sure that the cost that's borne locally is a cost that the utility can fairly collect from those who are served. Right, and so that's a function of knowing what the cost is, right? Identifying what the needs are, what the priority spending is, things like water loss, water.
Can you include in that, how does encouraging or incentivizing these communities to consolidate? Because while, as mayor, I love to have everything on my own, but then a poor community a couple of miles down the road, they can't afford water, but I'm doing well. Can you put that in your statement as well?
Sure. Yeah. No. There's absolutely a place for that, and there's as other witnesses have talked about, you can have literal consolidation of the physical plant of different utilities when they're close enough to each other and when that makes sense. You can also have regionalization in ways that allow utilities to share management expertise and purchasing power to get economies of scale, and those are absolutely important things to look at. That they don't by themselves solve the problem, but they help. And so solving the problem, as I said, there's the federal money and the state money to make sure that the amount that needs to be spent locally is manageable. There's efficiencies and strategies at the local level to reduce the costs of providing the service, and there's assistance to individual households.
Mr. Proctor, before my time run out, I am a strong, strong component of skilled trades. And your company talks all about the jobs that will be created through this investment in our infrastructure, especially water. Can you please, in the time remaining, talk about that?
Well, every $1 billion of water infrastructure investment produces about 28,000 jobs, I think the statistics show. So it is, when we invest in our water, not only are we providing something essential for the health of our communities, but we're also helping those communities get off the ground by providing good-paying jobs that they can then put back into those communities.
It's a win-win. I close with this. We're looking at our tax structure tomorrow, I understand. We cannot take away those tax-exempt municipal bonds. It's critical that we keep that. Thank you so much, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, and the floor is for Mr. LaMalfa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panelists, for assembling here today. California, the State Water Resources Control Board recently released their annual compliance report, and it found that in 2016, nearly 5 million people were affected by their definition of water violations, which is triple the amount affected in 2015. In my district alone, the first district of Northeast California, there was 800 of these as what they're defining as violations in that new year, which shows there's a lot of work to be done to fix these issues and ensure the water is clean and safe as defined. Fixing these violations can be quite a challenge in the absence of funding. Again, in NorCal, there's a large amount of very small and unincorporated communities that don't have the tax base, don't have the prospering industries that they once had, and so the challenges are huge. And raising the funds for a project in the short term, maintaining these projects in the long term, it's a great strain on these small towns and unincorporated areas, these villages that don't have the budgets that they once had, even countywide. When they are able to raise the funds, ensuring that each project that they come forward with, that they comply with a long list, Mr. Chairman, of regulations and red tape from both the federal level and California's crushing state regulations, can be darn near impossible for these small towns. So, in the questions I want to pose, Mayor Cooper, and to also Mr. Peterson, given the uncertainty of increased federal funding and what we're dealing with around here, what are some of the regulatory burdens and other structural issues, problems that this committee could be tackling in order to help the dollars go farther in small, unincorporated communities or counties where, again, industry has been basically run off to stretch these dollars farther? So would both of you like to take a run at that?
Thank you very, very much for the question. I want to go back to two issues. First, address yours. The regulatory process is something we've been working on as U.S. mayors for the past 10 years. And I don't believe that we should go back to address some of the questions I know Mr. Lowenthal asked about the 10-year process. I think that's critically important. We are all stewards of our water. We have come a long way over the past 40 years in the Clean Water Act. So I believe science as well as social equity needs to also be looked at, and that we have to be looking at these regulations as they evolved. So the 10-year period, I think, is critical, so we can implement plans over the time period that we've been working on with Mr. Gibbs' bill. As far as what
Let me also allow time for Mr. Peterson too. So
I know, I'm sorry. And then as far as the monetary, that goes back, I believe, to the grants in a lot of the stressed areas. Right now, we can borrow money, and some cities have better borrowing capacity than others. In these distressed areas, we will continue to ask for grants and flexibility as far as implementing our plans for the best and most effective utilization of both our financial resources as well as boots on the ground doing the projects. Sorry, sir, for
no, it's
too
okay.
much time.
Thank you. And then please speak a little more to this, the structural problems that the regulatory burden is causing. Now in California, again, we have our own problems with the Resource Control Board. There seems to be further definition of these rules, of these laws that are changing and making the burden even higher. As I mentioned in my comments, 2015, the number tripled in 2016 to what they allege are violations. In the remaining time, please. So what can we do? What should we be doing to help address that?
Congressman, quickly, this is a challenge we face. It's probably the #1 challenge following the aging infrastructure issue. As we better understand the science of water, naturally there will be new regulations that we need to meet. We need to be smart about how we comply with those regulations, looking at things like integrated planning, where we can look at complying with multiple
How you
regulations.
comply, but how are reasonable are the regulations to begin with as they evolve?
And you know, that speaks to the public process. We need, as agencies, we need to all weigh in. We do that, and we need additional opportunities to give our input and feedback and share the science on both sides of the issue so that we develop balanced regulations.
So I don't believe the public knows what it's paying for as these regulations morph on. And I think if they really understood, they'd be more up in arms about what it's costing them to not have this new infrastructure they should have. So, Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lamalfa. Mr. Garamendi, we're up to you. It's your turn.
Thank you. There's been a lot of discussion here about what to do with the various hurricanes and the rebuilding of systems. And I note that in August, the President revoked the flood risk management program. It seems to me that it might be useful to keep that in mind. Much discussion from the witnesses about how to be resilient in the face of floods. But I guess the federal government's not going to require that in programs and funding programs, that we don't pay any attention any longer to flood risk management. Seems to be a rather stupid thing to do, but we ought to pay attention to that. So that ought to go back onto the agenda. And if the president doesn't want to reinstate that, then perhaps we ought to. Otherwise, we're wasting a lot of money. Secondly, every one of the witnesses has asked for more money. Correct? Is there any one of you that didn't ask for more money? No, all of you did. And we need more money. Tomorrow, the Republicans in this House are going to hold a half-day seminar on how to reduce federal revenues. Now, tell me how that's going to work if you want more money. I think we ought to keep in mind the totality of the issues that come before us and the way in which they interact. We can do all kinds of tax reduction policy, which is what I'm sure will come out of tomorrow's meeting, and you want more money for water systems, for wastewater management, for flood systems, for highways, for new nuclear weapons, on and on. Just tell me how we're going to do all of that when we are reducing federal tax revenue. Who would like to answer the question?
Congressman, if I could, let me just give you the art of the possible. When I joined our company in 1992, if we took the amount of pipe that we were replacing every year against the total amount of pipe that we had in the ground, we would have went on a 900-year replacement cycle. Far from sustainable, right? It's not going to last that long. In the 20 years or so that I've been at the company, we've taken that from 900 years down to 90 years. Our main breaks are half of the national standard AWWA, and we've done it without federal money. And we've done it on our rates. Our monthly rates are about $50 a month per customer. That's the art of the possible. It can be done, but it has to be done over larger groups of people. We have 450,000 customers in that particular division. And it can be done.
Excuse me, was that pipe American-made?
That pipe is American-made by one of the people sitting at the table here.
Now, but you did ask for access to federal dollars, didn't you?
Yes, sir. If we
Now, my question wasn't about how you could be more efficient, which is meritorious, but my question was about how do we get more federal dollars to meet the needs that all of you have when we're actually reducing federal revenues, or there are many who want to reduce federal revenues?
If I may?
Yes, please.
Thank you. And I don't want to repeat my whole testimony today, but I believe really what municipalities have been focused on is not just money. And we face money issues, our balanced budget as a city on a daily basis, but really the encouragement of integrated planning, flexibility, support of public-private partnerships, the bill that's being presented by one of the members, Mr. Gibbs. So there are other opportunities. Money is important. The flexibility in the existing funds and the state revolving funds.
Excuse me, but you're dancing around the fundamental issue that I've raised.
All right.
Every one of you have asked for more federal money for a variety of purposes, all good. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, the Congress of the United States is in tomorrow and the days following, setting out to reduce federal revenues. So how do we deal, and the larger infrastructure issue, $1 trillion infrastructure issue, are you suggesting it does not require federal money? It can all be done in public-private partnerships? Yes, sir.
Certainly not going to suggest that everything can be done with public-private partnerships, but I think there are three things that could be done that would leverage what we do have. Number one, when we invest in water infrastructure, that's not a static development. Water infrastructure spending generates economic activity, I think another $6 of GDP, that in turn generates additional tax revenues that could help offset that. Number two,
are we talking chicken and egg here? Which comes first, the federal revenue or the growth that occurs without the federal revenue?
Most certainly, the growth in spending will sustain the growth in tax revenues. And so there's perhaps an element of that, but there are two other ways to get at that, perhaps, that avoids that conundrum. One is the expansion of the WIFIA program. Right now, WIFIA provides a leveraging opportunity through the use of credit insurance that would enable the few federal dollars that we do have to go into that to greatly leverage into additional spending through private sector investment as well, which in turn would generate that economic activity, which would then in turn generate additional revenues. And then the last thing I would mention is lifting the cap on private activity bonds. The estimates are there. I think the last CBO estimate was...
I'm going to interrupt you, sir, but do any of those meet the needs of the infrastructure, water infrastructure? They are a piece of the puzzle, but by themselves, they are totally insufficient.
I would agree that none of those things by themselves
solves the problem. That brings me back to the point that I'm really raising here, in that we talk about a $1 trillion infrastructure program. We talk about water, drinking water and clean water, and on and on and on. At the end of the day, it requires federal resources, which are going to shrink if the current policies being enunciated by the President and by my colleagues on the Republican side are able to go forward. Thank you for the extra time, Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Garamendi. We're going to move to Mr. Gibbs.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to apologize for being late on another commitment. First of all, I got a response from my good friend from California. He says we're meeting to reduce federal revenues. No, we're trying to put policies in place, a tax plan in place that will create economic growth. If you believe that reducing the rates will reduce federal revenues over the long term, then my friend, we ought to just increase the rates. And that philosophy, the revenue is going to go up then. And I think most of us can agree increasing the tax rates will not bring in more revenue, but to get the economic growth, instead of having the new norm of 1%, 1.5% GDP growth, let's get that up to 3 or 4% growth by having a tax policy that works for our American families and businesses. And that's where my friend from California is a little misunderstood. I want to move into my questions here. First of all, Mayor Cooper, I enjoyed working with the Conference of Mayors, and all the kudos most kudos I've ever gotten in my life for today, I think, on my integrated planning bill. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate the Mayor's Council support, and also the in their written statement, the Public Works Council, American Public Works Council. Mayor, can you maybe elaborate a little bit if this integrated planning bill, goes through, how that'll help your community with flexibility? Maybe kind of emphasize that a little bit, the flexibility and how it impacts you.
Well, when we are looking at resiliency measures and we're looking at green infrastructure measures, this will give us an opportunity to prioritize the investments of what little dollars that we do have. And I know I hear that through the Water Council continually across the nation and the nation's mayors that are represented on our board. So going back to the discussion, it's not just about money. Money's important. Investment breeds return on dollars and helps some of the most needy in our community. But your bill and that process, after working on it for 10 years, and the time frames, and the flexibility, I think will bring a new era in partnership and intergovernmental partnerships to work together to address this need.
Would you agree, I heard earlier this question from the gentleman, Mr. Levine. But the 5-year, my bill keeps the 5-year permitting. It would have been easier to write a 10-year permitting bill for this, but it keeps the 5 years, and I like to think of it as adaptive management or fine-tuning. When that 5 years comes up, we can fine-tune it to get to reach the goals that our local municipalities need to reach, and work with the EPA. Would you agree, concur?
Yeah, I've been fortunate not to be under consent decrees and not being on the enforcement end of water issues, and those become quite arduous. And what happens is you're paying and spending more money after addressing something that might be not necessarily fundamentally scientific in nature. And I'm certainly not a technician, and I have to at least yield that my understanding and working knowledge of water issues, that sometimes they are arduous.
I agree. I got to move on because of my time. Mr. Proctor, good to see you again. Can you talk, I got a couple points in testimony. Can you explain encouraging full cost accounting lead to water systems being more efficiently run and help in compliance with the Clean Water Act? Can you elaborate on the full cost accounting?
Yes, good to see you as well. Like any economic activity, understanding your full costs is essential in making certain that you make the smartest decisions possible. And full cost accounting would go a long way toward doing that. It would not only perhaps help utilities better price their product, which is something we've talked a little about here today, but also to find the areas that are driving those costs so they can try and reduce those costs to do more with less. And so whether you get to full cost accounting down the road, you may not actually get there, but at least full cost accounting is an essential first step. And just to state it philosophically, none of us could get a loan from a bank either to buy a car or buy a house or fund a business unless we had a good understanding of what our expenses and costs are. And the taxpayers really deserve the same thing as the lenders in this program.
I kind of have a theory on this, at least on the public side. We kind of live on depreciation. We don't account for depreciation, where on the private water side, they probably are to stay in business. You concur that's part of the problem. We don't account for depreciation on the public side?
I think in large part, a lot of utilities do not account for depreciation, which is another word for the future cost of investment in future infrastructure to sustain itself over the long term. That's where life cycle costing, which is an element of full cost accounting, would provide a great service to taxpayers just so they understand what it costs to provide this service over the long term.
My time's expired. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs, and also for your insight on decreasing burden as we increase revenue. I think unquestionably, one of the biggest things we need to avoid in this institution is the notion that somehow our grade goes up, our grade on the report card goes up solely based on what we spend, that if we spend $1 extra, we somehow get a better ranking. That can't be the way that this institution functions, especially when we consider it's the fruits of other people's labor that we deal with here. And in that, I want to move to Ms. Brownlee. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, I just wanted to give a little bit of a shout out to Mr. Peterson and the Las Virgenes Water District. They have been recycling water since 1972, and I consider them one of California's pioneers. So thank you for all of your good work. I had 3 questions, and I think Mr. Lowenthal really asked the first one, but I do want to comment, and I heard Mr. Levine's response to Mr. Lowenthal's question as well. But I think this notion of an extension of 5 years to 10 years for the MPDES permit is an interesting idea, and I think it's worth exploring to see if we can find a happy medium here in a win-win process, understanding that not every situation is exactly the same across the country. So I certainly would encourage continuing that conversation. The second question that I have goes back to recycled water. And Mr. Peterson, you had mentioned in your testimony, you talked about a new project in your district with the Triumpho Sanitation District that would create up to, I think, 5,000 acre-feet of drought-resistant water supplies. So I wanted to ask you, in putting together the financing package for this, can you tell us which federal programs you found to be most helpful, and whether you have any suggestions for Congress on how to augment or improve those programs to help spur more of these types of projects?
Sure. Thank you, Congresswoman. The project that you're referring to as our Pure Water project, it will ultimately develop 5,000 acre-feet of new drought-resilient water through reservoir augmentation. It's one of only 3 projects of its type in California. Certainly, we have built up some reserves to the tune of about $20 million locally to pay for that project, recognizing that local monies need to be dedicated to these projects. But in terms of the federal framework for infrastructure financing, the SRF program is essential and very important to us. Granted, it's a loan program, but the low-interest loan provides great value to us, and the ability to finance those improvements, which are about $100 million for an agency that is relatively small, a rate base of about 20,000 customers, or combined with our partner Triumphal Sanitation District, about 35,000 customers. The WIFIA program that was recently initiated is a fantastic program. We were one of 40-some applicants that submitted a letter of interest. There were many CASA and Aqua members who were invited back to submit full applications, and we think that's a valuable program and will be helpful. And then, of course, the Bureau of Reclamation Title 16 program and a variety of research programs and programs for demonstration projects are very helpful for projects of this type. We really think water recycling is really the future for resiliency in California, along with other local projects.
Thank you very much, and I will just add that in this particular water district, there is no local water source at all, and now Las Virgenes actually provides 20% of the region's demand with recycled water. The other question, Mr. Peterson, I wanted to ask too is, in WRDA 2014, our committee requested a report on the Clean Water State Revolving Fund allocation formulas. The report was just finalized earlier this year, and can you comment on the report and the recommendations in it?
Yes, absolutely. So the report, this was a report requested by the subcommittee. It's included as an exhibit to my written testimony. An excellent report prepared by the U.S. EPA. It's an impartial report that uses data to analyze the distribution of federal SRF funds to states. And what the report essentially found, in short, is that those formulas are dated and that they require updating. And the main reason is that those formulas were established based on 1987 data, both for population and demographics of all the states, and also the clean water needs of those states. And we know both of those issues, both of those figures have changed dramatically in that time. And there's really a need to take a look at updating that. The report includes a number of options, and any one of those options would be a big step forward, and we would encourage the subcommittee to take a look at that report and to work with the EPA on bringing forward those recommendations for action.
Can I speak very quickly to two of your questions?
Yes, please.
On the 10-year extension, so I won't rehash the concerns I raised earlier, but I do believe that they're very valid. The underlying issue, it seems, of the reasons that this 10-year extension and the integrated planning issue are being raised is a desire for flexibility in prioritizing and recognizing the time that it takes to implement expensive capital improvements, right? And that general principle is not something that I think is controversial, right? We've had, there's a letter submitted, signed not only by NRDC, but by a number of other environmental organizations before this hearing, pointing out the values, the virtues of integrated planning as per EPA's framework that was issued a few years ago. As far as the role of Congress and this committee, what's important, I think, to understand is that the existing Clean Water Act provides that flexibility, and the EPA framework document lays that out. The issue of the length of compliance schedules is something that Congress has asked the National Academy of Public Administration to look into the financial capability assessment guidance that EPA has that governs negotiations around those compliance schedules. The Academy is due out with that study this month. Right, that provides an opportunity for EPA to consider those findings and revisit the guidance. And on WRDA and recycled water, I'll just point out, and it's mentioned in my testimony, Congress in 2014 inserted provisions requiring that Clean Water SRF funded projects use to the maximum extent that they can in cost-effective way water reuse, water efficiency. It's not being implemented particularly well, and I urge the committee to support EPA, push EPA to implement that better.
Thank you, and my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And I just want to open with a couple of questions for the entire panel. I mean, everybody is anticipating, a large infrastructure package. It's something we're all waiting for. We're excited about. I see the smiles that it puts on your face as we even mention it, because it is exciting. So that's where I want to get a little bit into the public-private partnerships. Give me your view. What is your go-to on this? Where do you see it? And it's open to the entire panel. And, from there, if you want to, give me what is your favorite? What is your go-to for any sort of consolidation that you see between public and private and the #1 program that you would want to work towards? By all means, Mr. Peterson.
Thank you. Two important issues to us. We do believe that there's value in the public-private partnership, although we don't believe in any way it's a panacea for infrastructure financing. As a public agency, we have engaged in P3s. We found them to be effective in certain areas of our business, renewable energy, solar, where there's tax credits that the private companies can take advantage of. But we do not believe that for big infrastructure projects like our recycling project, that we can generate more value for our ratepayers and lower rates through public-private partnerships uncategorically. With regard to consolidation and regionalization, we do have some concerns with both of those issues. Again, we do think there are circumstances that warrant agency consolidation, and we think that that's currently happening, and we see that happening in California. And there's incentives to do that already, but we don't think a federal policy, especially a broad-based federal policy to push for consolidation, is a good thing. We think that these issues are better handled at the local level, where local folks are familiar with some of the nuances involving geography, hydrology, climate differences that really govern these. And so we would recommend that the committee keep that at the local level.
Anybody else? Carte blanche? Yes, sir, Mr. Franklin.
I would agree that a lot of these things should be handled at the state and local levels. Often what we serve in the million customers or so that we serve, it is small local level, small community well systems, community wastewater systems. But I'll underscore that the $1 billion plus that we spend every 3 years doesn't have a single federal dollar in it. And the expertise we put out there and the results that we put out there are put in our proxy statement required by the SEC that would underscore the connection we've made for also pay for performance. In other words, our high standards are what we pay our people for. That's what they're incented to do. And I guess in terms of federal dollars, all I would say from the NAWC standpoint, the access that we would like is access to the existing SRF funds for wastewater. Not asking for additional, but the existing. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Public-private partnerships, I believe, and I don't want to be repetitive, are important, but I don't think there should be a mandate for any public partnership tied to these programs. They're not a one-size-fits-all, and different private-public partnerships fit different circumstances. We can do it in a municipality, we can do it for wastewater. We do have an intergovernmental municipal partnership. Water, we don't. We build buildings, a lot of them are shared public-private. So our main concern is we are learning lessons learned of this new era of public-private partnerships, but to tie them to mandates also impacts the ability to create local jobs. And that was one of the concerns we faced in Florida this year, even through the state mandates, that they wanted to tie it to, they wanted to tie into our contracts to mandate hiring. And we want to create local jobs as well as regional jobs. So it's...
Yeah, by all means, Mr. Proctor. And don't worry about being repetitive. This is Congress.
I'm sorry.
Say,
I am so
everything's
sorry.
been said, but not everybody has said it yet. So.
Thank you very much.
Our working group very much believes that this decision is a local one and a voluntary one as well. But there's a difference. One of the things I think we all ought to focus on is it's one thing to talk about incentives, but it's also another thing to talk about disincentives. Presently, there are some barriers in place that prevent local municipalities and other utilities from even considering partnerships where they'd like to. For example, the defeasance penalty if you go into a concession, and also just simply the cost associated with planning, negotiating, and implementing a P3. For a small utility of 500 people, a legal bill of $50,000, $75,000 may be an actual impediment to even having the conversation about whether a P3 is in their best interest. Now, the Clean Drinking Water SRF does allow some funding for that sort of activity, but it's maybe perhaps less so on the clean water side. But my point is, make certain that we don't create disincentives as we go through this process. And then one other thing I would like to mention is this, that we haven't really touched on in much detail, and that's non-financial partnerships. I mentioned it in my written testimony. The opportunities for collaboration among large utilities and small utilities for the implementation of technology that can save money, make the administration and management of these utilities more effective, preserve human health and the environment are incredible. And there are a lot of things that can be done to help make that happen that fall way short of consolidation or regionalization that could really move the needle.
Thank you for those responses.
Okay, if I can.
We're actually going to move into a second round of questioning, so I'm going to go to to a ranking member Napolitano here, and if we get back to you for an opportunity to respond to that, so be it.
Well, you could have gone ahead because we're just you and me and Mr. Gibbs. It is difficult for me to make sense of how the administration believes the best to address our nation's water-related infrastructure. Because as a candidate, he proposed tripling requests for clean and drinking water state revolving funds, but they didn't materialize in his budget. It sure didn't come through in his fiscal year 2018 budget. And now we hear that the majority of his forthcoming infrastructure investment proposal will involve leveraged private sector financing rather than infusion of additional federal capital into the state revolving fund programs. In my view, the model leaves behind many mid-sized and small communities, and rural, of course, that may be unable to compete with larger cities and unable to afford the costs of leveraged private capital. In your view, all of you, if the plan is heavily dependent on leveraged private capital, would this miss the mark in addressing infrastructure needs of many mid-sized and small communities? And if you were to make recommendations to Congress on the appropriate mechanisms to address these needs, what programs would you recommend to fund and what levels? Anybody, everybody.
Ranking member. Yes, is the...
A short answer, please.
Yes, certainly. As others have said, private money is not a panacea, and the bottom line on it is that when private money comes in to invest in a system, there has to still be a revenue stream to pay back that private investment. And so it ultimately comes down to whether the community, whether the ratepayers can afford that expense without financial assistance, especially in the form of grants from the federal government, from state government. So that private money is simply not a panacea.
Go ahead, Ms. Cooper.
Oh, thank you. Definitely the recommendation for the Internal Revenue Code to remove the state volume caps for private activity bonds, as well as preserving our muni bonds.
That would help.
Yes, definitely.
Mr. Proctor.
And going back to the WIFIA program, right now that program is set up for the most part to deal with $20 million projects, $5 million in a smaller setting. But as it's currently structured, it does tend to favor projects that are probably financed okay to begin with. If there's a way that that program could be tweaked and tap into its leveraging feature so that it could help out more distressed utilities, that would be a positive thing.
Mr. Peterson.
Thank you. I think certainly there's value to leverage private capital, but I think we cannot overlook the importance of continuing to capitalize the SRF program. And we would support your bill and your recommendation and look at even enhancing that program to the $3 to $4 billion range.
StPierre.
Yeah, I would just repeat that. You know, when you are loaning money for 1.75% versus 3% or 6%, and what you're doing is you're reducing the amount of work that you can do. Obviously, there's a lot of work to do. A full support of SRF funding is critical.
Mr. Gonzalez?
Yes, we've got a history of working with the Corps of Engineers, the Bureau of Reclamation, the SRF, and so forth, and most of these funds have dried up. We're looking at pretty significant increases in rates to be able to accommodate some of these projects, and as I mentioned, the projects we're looking at are in excess of $100 million, and so when you look to a federal agency that the most they can provide is $20 million over a 3 to 4 year time frame because they're competing, you're having to compete with other entities, it's not even close to saying it's not going to have a significant impact on ratepayers.
Okay. Mr. Franklin.
Thank you. Whether municipal or regulated utility, I think there's a myriad of answers to this, not a single bullet, and I think we've all come to that conclusion. I will say, though, that probably half of the customers we service are in small, rural areas. And it's the economies of scale, whether you're municipal or not, that really come to bear. Even though these systems aren't interconnected, they're the same people, so they can share employees, share knowledge, and so that ability to reduce this 50,000 water systems in the country to some manageable number that really allows us to bring economies of scale will make us all long-term more viable.
Thank you very much, and I would ask that if you have those recommendations, please put them in writing so this committee can look at them and take them into consideration. There's lots of impacts to the business community that if you don't have clean water, you don't have economy, so it's important for them too. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ranking Member Napolitano. And Mr. Gibbs?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I just want to elaborate a little bit on this the private-public partnerships. If we can't do it in this area, I don't know where we can do it. I've been so hopeful, and I understand what you said about the 1 3/4% and the 3%. And, we just got to figure this out. Now, one thing, Mr. Proctor, you talked about the WIFIA program. I'm pleased that the EPA is going to expect to issue their first round of grants, and I guess. Can you, and I'll do all, but maybe Mr. Proctor wants to start. How can we improve the WIFIA and on the SRF program for that matter, you know, considering a larger infrastructure package to make this work? And I would include the private partnerships in here, because you always could do a blending thing. You get capped off in the money you get from SRF and stuff, you still need more. You know, maybe we blend that interest rate, you know, to make this thing work. But my big concern is if we can't come up with any public-private partnerships in this area where we have ratepayers, where you have a stream of revenue coming in, I don't know how you do it anywhere else in government. And so I'll just open it up for what suggestions, and then maybe we might have to put those in writing and offer them to the committee to get more detail, but just to kind of generalize it right now.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Well, with respect to WIFIA, one of the first things Congress could do would be to extend it. I think it expires as a pilot in 2018, is that right? So extending it at least another 5 years, but even better, making it permanent so that the markets can react and know what they're going to deal with over the long term would be important. Obviously, increased funding. I've alluded to it several times a second ago over the course of my testimony, but the leveraging feature through credit insurance as a way to bring in private capital is extremely powerful. You can almost leverage every federal dollar that goes into the program by $65 by utilizing the funds that go into WIFIA for credit insurance as opposed to direct loans or other grants and that sort of thing. And that's a pretty hefty return on your dollar there.
Can I speak to that leveraging issue?
Go ahead.
The SRFs as well provide opportunities for leveraging, which most states don't take advantage of as much as they could. And in my written testimony, I get into some extensive detail about a proposal that we offer that would incentivize states to leverage to a greater extent by allowing them to raise the cap on what's called additional subsidization, meaning the use of SRF funds as grants, to the extent that they leverage and put more state money into their SRF. Under our proposal, that would allow states to use more SRF funding as grant funds rather than loan funds. We illustrate how that would work to help states that have already been investing of their own funds, and how it would incentivize more states to do so and take advantage of those leveraging opportunities they already have.
Yeah, Mr. Peterson.
One other quick suggestion. The EPA has done a phenomenal job kicking off the WIFIA program. Kudos to them and their staff. But we think there could be value in coordinating the SRF program that's handled at the state level with the EPA WIFIA program. And there's some interest in EPA in doing that, and I think that would help local communities.
Yeah, the intent was the WIFIA to help supplement the SRF. I know a lot of people are getting, heartache thinking that it's going to eliminate SRF. That's not the intent of all the WIFIA program, to make that clear. Yeah, Mr. Franklin.
Congressman, I would just use as an example, say for the 300,000 people that we serve water to and wastewater to in Ohio, they're all federal taxpayers. And to be excluded from the ability to lower the cost of debt for those customers, since we don't have access to the Clean Water SRF, is really a disadvantage to those customers. So my strong recommendation would be that even the regulated utilities like ours get access to that same, so that we could keep that cost down for customers, whether they're municipal or they're investor-owned.
Okay. Yes, Mr. Pierre.
I'll just speak to the P3 partnership, and I wouldn't discount public-to-public partnerships. The issue here is there's a revenue stream, it's a set revenue stream, and it's economies of scale and its efficiencies. So you have 75,000 utilities across the country. That model isn't working well in rural areas. There is a need to consolidate. There is a need for a regionalization, whether that's public-public or public-private. That economy of scale provides margin and investment that's needed in communities that can't support it on their own.
Okay. Well, that's helpful. If you want to submit any more stuff in writing, there's specific examples how we can do that. Because I think hopefully we get to an infrastructure bill, and this could be a key component because there's so many jobs created and there's so much need out there because this infrastructure we know is 80 years old on average. So we've got to fix it. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Gibbs. If there are no further questions, I would just like to thank each and every one of you for your very thoughtful testimony this morning. It was very informative, very helpful. And without anything else to add, this committee stands adjourned.